Hello to everyone listening. This is another in a series presented by the Methow Valley Interpretive Center for our Docent Training in Public Education. My name is Rich Davis, Archaeology Advisor to the Methow Valley Interpretive Center, and I've been an avocational archaeologist for close to 30 years. My specialty has been the identification of chipstone and groundstone tools. Before we begin our slide presentation, I feel the need to speak about our archaeology exhibits here at the Interpretive Center. We have begun a project here called the Methow Artifact Research Project. This project reaches out to Valley residents who might have come into possession of artifacts from the Indian people who have lived here for thousands of years. The artifacts that are brought forward can be photographed and interpreted. They can be kept by the owners or can be donated. If they are donated, they can become part of our curations and are displayed with interpretations of use, possible age, material types, and so on for the education of our visitors, researchers, and to preserve the legacy of the Methow people whose ancestors resided here. The slides and information shown in this presentation are meant to familiarize interested people with the basic information needed to identify artifacts and stone materials. There are two major categories of stone tools. There are the ground stones and there are the chipstone. This slide explains the uses and the characteristics of both. The examples that we'll be showing in future slides and that are very evident in our display cases of ground stone tools were used in food processing or woodworking or weaponry. Hammerstones were used for and choppers, pestles, and salmon pounders. Some of the tools have been polished, like axes and celts and hammers. Many of them have signs of hafting, which means attaching handles to axes, hammers, and netweights. These tools are called pestles. There are various kinds of pestles. One in the first slide was probably imported from the coast. They're not common on the North Centre Columbia Plateau. It's very unusual, and especially for the Methow Valley. It took a lot of refinement and shaping in order to create this. It was done by pecking and polishing. The second example is another type of pestle or pounder. You can see the abrasions on the bottom of it where it's been beaten against some kind of a surface to pound or break things up. Sometimes they were called salmon pounders, especially the longer ones where they would dry salmon, pound it into a powder, mix it with venison or some other fat and berries, create cakes that were dried and was used in the winter. In many areas it's called pemmican. Right now I don't have the name, and I would like to, of the cakes that were formed in this area. The third item is very unusual and difficult to identify for me, but I believe it was used with the item to the right of it, which is a paint pot, a mortar, and it was used to grind pigments for paints that were used in pictographs, for paints that were used on bodies and decorations. You can still see the iron oxide that's left from the previous time that it was used to grind that particular color of pigment. These tools, as is stated, were used for pounding, splitting by driving wood wedges into logs to create canoes and carvings and other useful wooden tools. The third item, number 26, is its curation number, was probably some kind of a sharpening tool. It's pretty obvious that it had been used to polish or sharpen another stone tool. These stone tools were called hafted tools, which merely means that somehow or another they were attached to a handle. You can see how they were shaped in order to receive the probably rawhide or fibers that attach them to whatever handle was needed. These tools were shaped probably by pecking, but also they were polished in order to form the shape that was most useful. The important part of the livelihood of the people who lived here in the Methow Valley was obtaining fish from the river and from the lakes. They made nets out of hemp, or probably other materials as well, and they put these nets into the water and they weighted the ends down and the centers sometimes when it was in the current. And these various styles of weights were used to hold the netting down into the water or to attach it to the shoreline. This slide is a photograph of a tool cache and material cache that was generously shown to us by Mr. Merle Kirkley, who found it on his property up by Wolf Creek. It was buried, and he found it while landscaping there. Obviously, these pieces of material had great value. Some of them were already being formed into tools. In fact, some of them might even be finished tools. The material came from somewhere besides the Methow Valley, we're quite sure. You can see the petrified wood and chert and so on that had to be imported from somewhere else. Another facet of this photograph is that it shows the different kinds of material that were needed for chipstone tools. It had to be of an almost cryptocrystalline nature, which means it was almost glass-like. It flakes really well, holds a very sharp edge, and that edge has to hold up under a lot of cutting pressure, etc. These tools could have been used for carving, cutting, manufacturing tools made out of bone and leather, fibers, etc. They also could be fashioned into future weapons. This exhibit, one that we have here at the Interpretive Center, shows a progression of chipstone tool manufacture. We printed up on the exhibit an explanation of what each one of these artifacts mean with numbers associated with them. There's not much else to say about this. It's very interesting. This process has been used for hundreds of thousands of years by people. It hasn't changed a whole lot, but an expert can tell a whole lot of things from this type of manufacture. In fact, people have created a whole career on the intricacies of this, but we'll just leave it at what we have here. It's a means of giving people a basic understanding of how tools are made and giving them an opportunity to identify something that they find in the field, because these things are everywhere. Once you learn how to recognize them, you'll find that you'll see them along the rivers, in the hills, etc., etc. And I hope if you do, you'll bring them to our attention. Another part of our exhibit is the identification of various cultural phases in chronology. Projectile points provide us a relative dating method. That means that it's not positive, but it gives us, within a larger time frame, a way of identifying a period of time by which that site was created or the projectile point and other tools around it were created. This is done by stratigraphy, which is all part of an excavation and determining the various levels as the excavation proceeds down into the earth. And when you reach an artifact or carbon or some other material that's cultural, belong to a group of people that might have lived there, often it can be dated by radiocarbon dating, and that gives a relatively close age to that particular level that's being excavated and any tools that are associated with it. This is one of the primary ways that we can identify the age of a site and the age of projectile points and tools that can be further used in other areas to determine the age of those sites. Phases allow a generalized understanding of a society's progression through time. And we're going to show a little rough display in the next slide about that. These phases, although hard to read here in the slide probably, are all part of our exhibit information, and they're merely meant to show how over time the various cultures and groups existed here, both with their chipstone tool technology and their subsistence patterns, and what the climate might have been like during that period of time. I want to talk a little bit about projectile points here. To my way of thinking, projectile points are one of the best stone tool types to be used to identify the people who occupied any area over time. Each projectile point style represents a period of time in history. We mentioned stratigraphy earlier as being the primary method by which we can place dates on artifacts such as projectile points. These dates are called chronologic periods by scientists. By associating the style of projectile point with these chronologic periods, we can often determine the age of the culture whose contextual remains are associated with the projectile point. The projectile points that are shown in this slide are all from this valley, and they are replicated in our display area in the Seasons of People room. The dates on these projectile points range back to 10,200 years before present. We have attempted to display them with the phase information related to each specimen, thus giving the viewer an ability to determine the lifeways of the people who existed at the time the projectile point was created. One question that arises is the difference between projectile points and arrowheads. Projectile point is a general term including spearheads, dart points, atlatl points, and arrowheads. Most all projectile points that were created before a couple thousand years ago were for spears or atlatls. Most of them that came along afterwards were for arrowheads, obviously for use with a bow. I'd like to conclude with this last slide showing some of the artifacts that people have allowed us to photograph, and they're really unique. Thought it might be worth your interest, although all but the center one is not displayed because the owners wish to remain anonymous and keep the other two. We still have them here in our records. The one on the left is a stone knife made out of a fossilized piece of bone. It was dug up in an irrigation excavation up by Winthrop. We don't have the funding to have it tested or further identified. Hopefully someday that might occur. The one on the right side is a slate knife, extremely rare anywhere in the state of Washington, particularly on the Columbia Plateau. Only a couple have ever been recorded or been shown to be in private collections. This was found up near Winthrop. The owners wished to remain anonymous and retain the artifact. However, it is a treasure for sure. The center artifact is called a banner stone. It was donated by George Wooten, one of our board members, who claims it was found in Chilloust. It's really a rare find again, almost unknown in at least eastern Washington, but in Washington in general. But on the East Coast, it was quite common. It was part of an atlatl, which is a spear-throwing device. It was used as a weight to give more strength to the thrower of the atlatl, give them more power and more impact when the atlatl struck its target. It is on display. We hope to continue with our program, our project, and create, in fact, is in the process of being done now, a catalog that will show all of these artifacts and more information about each one of them. The result of that will be information that research or people with a further interest in our displays can use to enhance their knowledge. Thank you very much for your time.